Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Future by Design webinar series. Today, I am joined by Paul Gordon, and the topic is the 25 million stakeholder decision. So thank you everyone for joining us live today, and also for those of you who are watching on our online community and digital learning platform. We present these free live webinars every week, so please share them, get involved in the conversation, and join us as we create a future by design. Paul Gordon, who is joining me today, is the Technical Director and CEO of Catalyze APAC. His roles include facilitation, design, and implementation of strategy, decision-making, and decision support processes, senior client and stakeholder engagement, program management, and business development. He is a highly accomplished business leader with over 20 years experience in consulting. He has worked in a wide range of sectors and particularly extensively with the defence and security sectors in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, and elsewhere extensively over the last 15 years. Paul has been involved in facilitating many key decision points for major programs and strategic planning initiatives. His earlier career experience includes successful facilitation and support for technology transfer, bringing together diverse consortia of research organisations and commercial companies to drive innovation and new thinking. He is committed to transforming the way the world makes strategic decisions, to collaborate, value-focused decision-making with clear, open communication, and frequently works with top teams in the public and private sectors to facilitate major decisions. That is a very impressive bio, Paul, and I'm going to have to kick us off with the sign behind you, Decision by Design. I love it.
Carefully crafted, especially for you today, Lisa.
I love it.
Great to be here. And you know, as I was thinking about this session coming up, what does it, in my world, what does a future look like? Future by design look like? It looks like decision making by design, not by chance. So, you know, the bit that's not written on the sign is the bit that says many decisions of the world today are made by chance. We just stumble upon them. They just happen. There's no thinking associated with them. And, you know, part of my passion is to shift from that kind of decisions just happen, we trip over them, and then frequently look back and go, how did that happen? I wish it hadn't, into a world where we're making decisions by design through structured processes, through more, as my bio says, more collaborative, value-focused decision-making. That's so, I thought, you know, it'll be a bit of fun. Amazing what you get came up.
And you're coming to us from Canberra today, and how relevant, given that it's budget day?
Yeah, I'm right here. I mean, I can point from my office window at Parliament. So we're in 2.5 hours. The budget will be handed down by the Treasurer, and the nation, one might imagine, waits with bated breath for what those results might say. And, you know, looking at the world that we've just come through, and obviously this is a delayed budget. So this budget was due to be the normal May budget, pushed back now because of COVID to allow government to, I guess, rethink and structure its decisions to be more appropriate for the current environment. So in some respects, a highly anticipated day. And I might say, who knows, but I might say perhaps less anticipated than how it might be were all 25 million Australians involved in the decision process to set the budget, which is what I think the future looks like in decision making.
Totally brilliant. I was about to ask you if all 25 million people in Australia, the population of Australia, do you feel like they're engaged and have buy-in to this current budget, or have felt like they've participated in the decisions that have been made for the budget?
Oh, tricky question. Of course, I would say no, because I can see a way that that can look different from how it looks today. So, and you know, when I think of, so, and interesting, you look at the title for today, 25 million stakeholder decision, you might say, yeah, they're happening all the time. There are 25 million stakeholders in the budget decision, but I think the future that's different from today is a level of active participation of those stakeholders. So the difference between kind of on our behalf decisions are made. Yes, we're a stakeholder. We you know, we have the effect of the decisions, but I think the opportunity, in fact, I know the opportunity is to shift to where actually we have some participation in that decision making. And that's the, both the opportunity and the challenge. That's, I guess, what drives me to transform the way the world makes decisions.
I love that. And I think that's a really good way to see it, is appreciate how it is now. And then we love to create that future by design. And so what I'd love to do is take us backwards a little bit and ask primarily, why did you get into this line of work? What kicked you off on this path, and even the history of what decision making was like when you got into the industry.
Oh, that's a great question. And there's the kind of the poster answer, and there's the real answer. So I'll give you the real answer, just because it's just me and you here, Lisa. The real answer is I kind of came across it by chance. And actually, that's one of the reasons why now when I look back, I go, wow, if I'd seen this world of decision science, which underpins everything I do, if I'd seen this world and had it in front of me, I'd have jumped at it. It just happens I fell into it. And once I found it, it was like, oh my goodness, there really is a science of decision making. There is a way that we can make decisions where we have some better say in the outcomes, we're much happier with the outcomes, etc. So the abridged version was, I, like many of my fellow entrepreneurs, found myself wanting to have my own business. I started that in 2000. That was in the world of software development and doing some quite interesting things. And then I came across Catalyze, a consulting firm working in the realm of decision making, and I saw this and met Bob Kitchen, who's the founder of Catalyze. I met him, and we had some very interesting conversations about what the future could look like. And me, through my software background, went, I can see the technology piece, and he was talking more from the people piece. And when I saw that marriage of the human piece in decision making and then how technology and data can support it, that was what had me hooked. And I guess really the passion came from seeing what's possible and how little that was at play at the time. So when I, nearly 20 years ago, when I came across this world, the view of it was extremely uncommon to even talk about decision making as a thing. Just decision making is what we do. Leaders make decisions. It just happens that way. And when I saw what's possible when you start to think about decision making as a thing, what we call decision thinking, suddenly it was like, well, the whole world needs this, because here's the opportunity. Once we realize that participating actively in decision making, seeing transparently how decisions get made, understanding the outcomes, leads to decisions we're happier with, that make better use of resources, that are more consistent. When I could see that as a possibility, I was, if I can have a hand in that, I'm off. So that's kind of what had me hooked at that time. And I also think it was really that people process. Once I came across that and started to, I could have imagined in my software days that with all the right computers and data, decisions just get made, it's easy. And when I realized that, of course, it's people that make decisions, not computers, I started to see, well, how do you do that much better than is being done at the moment? So that kind of drew me in. And then I started actually experiencing it and working with organizations where they were stuck with decisions, they were making poor decisions, and I could see how that could turn around. It became, dare I say it, the decision drug.
It's beautiful. I think in speaking to you, when you talk about decisions as a science, I've just put it in the chat, decision science. That is incredible. And most of us, probably our mindset, we would know that we make decisions all of the time. But when you do get to those kinds of decisions and really large decisions, there is a science behind how you can actually gather all of the information and strategically make a decision.
And decision science is a really exciting field because it cuts across most domains of science. So it ranges from kind of your mathematics and your economics up the numerical end, all the way through to psychology and the social sciences up the other end. And it's that sort of amalgam of all of those that leads to this idea that decision making can be a conscious thing. And like many things, until you shine a light on it, most people don't even realize that. The world of decision science kind of opened itself up to me and had me very interested. And historically, back in the software days, I'm an engineer, so I'm always looking at, well, science is fine until it hits the real world. So I find myself perfectly in that place called, well, the science is all very well, but unless it actually impacts the future, the real world, human beings making decisions, organization making decisions, a bit so what. So that's really where I guess I find myself, and I guess my firm and what we're doing is kind of making it real, actually having it out there.
Very, very cool. So what is the current state of some of the decisions that are being made, and the process that you go through? I do enjoy, sorry, I'm going to jump in there. I really love your mindset and your optimism in, because you are looking into the future and seeing how it can be, as well as you're actually currently doing it at the same time.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that has me propelled is at each time I work with an organization. So most of mine and my team's work is in the consulting realm. So we're working with organizations who are struggling with complex decisions, or might not even know they're struggling with complex decisions. They see themselves facing problems, and what we bring to them is a decision, I guess, lens, a way to look at the world, to say, well, underneath every problem there are decisions to be made, and if we can cut through the problems to the decisions, now we've got a way we can deal with them. Every time I do that and I engage people in I guess decision thinking, they kind of light up and sit back and go, oh, it is possible. So it's a bit like showing people something they thought might not be possible. I remember a few years ago, I was working in the New Zealand government, and there was this big decision they were making about a multi-million-dollar procurement, and two key government agencies that were at loggerheads, and they said, there is no way we're going to agree on the outcome. It's just not possible, literally throwing their hands up. And, the chief executives, the chief information officers were all kind of just like, this isn't going to happen. So when they started to bring, we went in to help them and looked at, okay, how can we bring some structure to this decision-making approach that brings both the people and the computers together? They started to kind of roll their sleeves up and get stuck in. And of course, when they actually reached the decision, the relief and the sort of, we got there it's addictive. It's like, why can't everyone have that experience versus most people, as you might say, the current state of decision-making, which is a lot of frustration about decisions not being the way people want them, experience of, inefficiency in decision-making processes, feeling like resources aren't being best invested. I mean, a good example is, and of course it's current, right? If you stood in the shoes of, say, our Prime Minister here, or the Prime Minister of New Zealand, or any of these key leaders having to make really crunchy decisions today around COVID. What are we going to do? Trading off somehow between freedom, limiting freedom, managing border controls, managing lockdowns versus stimulating the economy. So these are really big, hard decisions that as soon as you make a decision one way or the other, it touches on everyone, affects everyone's lives. And for me, the opportunity to see that, I guess, have a light shone on that and have everyone see how that's working. That's part of the challenge. If you look at the upset and you look at all the noise that is on social media, so much of that comes from either misinformation or lack of information. It's not necessarily it's the right or the wrong decision. It's just, I'm not vested, I'm not empowered, I'm not engaged in that decision. And so I can totally understand why there is so much noise around open the borders, close the borders, stimulate the economy, look after the healthcare system, protect people's health, protect the old, you can see all the different things that are going on in the decision processes. And if we are not engaged as stakeholders in that conversation, then all the evidence suggests we will spend a lot of our time on the other side of a decision, just throwing rocks at it, saying they made a wrong decision, they should have done it this way. Whereas once we can participate, same decision may get made, yet our engagement and ownership of it will have our support for it. I've got some, just on that, stop me if I take myself off my own tangents, I'm good at that. But I think back to quite a few years ago in the UK, a really big decision that we were working with. In fact, at the time, it was the largest ever public consultation exercise. And the government, prior to us working with them from a conscious decision-making, decision-thinking perspective, they'd made a decision, they'd announced the decision, there'd been uproar from all the environmentalists. This was in the realm of what to do with nuclear waste from the nuclear power industry. So quite a heavy decision that impacts many people. They made a decision, everyone threw their toys out the pram, caused uproar, and the government just paused any action on it and said, okay, this is too difficult to deal with. Literally 10 years later, from engaging with, in fact, Catalyze and our thinking about decision thinking and the way to approach it in a structured way, we then put in place this multi-stakeholder, it wasn't millions, but it was hundreds of stakeholders actively participating in workshops, sleeves rolled up, how do we grapple with these issues? And looking across the whole spectrum, from the people who are pro-nuclear energy to the people who are anti-nuclear energy to the futurists, to you can imagine the realm of opinion there is if you just say nuclear power. And through what, of course I would say this, but good process and good structured decision making, got to the end of the process. The government announced the decision, everyone's clapping and cheering, headlines are positive, great decision, well done government. Guess what the decision was? The same as they'd made 10 years ago. Yes. So it has nothing to do with the decision. It's all about how they got there. And when I see that, what's possible, and just taking those two as completely black and white experiences, the opportunity for decisions that get executed more easily, that stick once they've been made, that people support, isn't about whether they got their way or not. It's much more about how they could participate.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess it's a lot of mindset, and there's an education process in that. And then the technology that can empower that as well to start engaging more people. If you think back 100, 200 years ago, there was no chance that any of us were going to be involved in decisions. Yet today, and particularly with social media and the digitization of a lot of what we're doing, it is a lot more debatable. But then how do we actually engage completely in these decisions? And I ask as well, so one of the decisions that we do make as a 25 million population together is who we elect each election. And so I think for me, I actually wonder what the future could look like in that, because I know when I go in to vote, I don't feel like I have all of the information to be able to make that decision. I may have had some marketing pamphlets on my way in, how many of the 25 million population, or how many of the voters would actually have all the information on each policy, what each party represents, what's going to happen, depending on who gets elected.
And that's, one of the things that causes people to be dissatisfied with their decisions is information emerges they didn't see, or they feel uninformed, yet they feel, and in Australia, compelled to go and cast their vote. So it's almost like, well, am I even making a conscious decision about my vote, let alone what decision rights that gives to someone else because of my vote? So I've now elected you, you are then my proxy, and every single decision you make, I'm expecting you to make in my interest. Yet, of course, that's not possible either. So I think that, when we look at election processes and how the machinery of government fits together, there's a lot of, new ways to think about that. And, I want to be clear because, the federal government's one of my very important clients, and I'm not here to kind of say government doesn't work, throw it away. That's actually not the point at all. The point is, where do we move forward from here? What is possible? What could be possible in terms of reducing some of the upset, reducing some of the re-prosecution of decisions that are made, reducing some of the, impact of biases in decision making? What is actually possible? And that's when I look at the 25 million stakeholder decision. So it might be election processes look exactly the same in the future, but how we engage with that more ongoing decision process, or ongoing decisions, is really what I think about. We, of course, may still need to have the kind of parliamentary system that we do, but when it comes to where are you spending my taxes, or it comes to where are you investing my resources, or where are you directing, who I and I say loosely I as a citizen, because I'm actually not a citizen of Australia, so I have to be careful, even though I live here. But who any of us, and that, that in itself is a good question, because that's a statement of fact that I'm not a citizen, but I live here, I contribute to the tax system, I participate in Australia. So I am definitely a stakeholder of the decisions that government makes, even if I don't have a thing that says I'm an Australian citizen yet. So that's another, a question I'm always asking in decision processes: who even are the stakeholders, and are you looking broadly enough as to who you consider? Particularly because, that example about the nuclear decision, it was very tempting for government to say, we'll put together we'll put in a room the people that we know are going to be proactive and support our thinking, and kind of those awkward ones, we'll leave them out and hope they don't notice. And that's, again, current state of decision making, quite a lot of that goes on. It's too hard to have that conversation. Whereas if you provide the right environment and you get things in the right order, those, let's say, much more diverse stakeholders with diverse opinions, of course, add a lot of value. And that's another thing, I guess, that drives me, a passion for how you really harness diversity. You know, it's a little bit, of course, one might say the diversity word is overused at the moment. It feels it's a popular thing to talk about. And I always ask the question, so what does that look like in reality? And for me, it looks like, when I think about a decision, you're taking people who both are a definite yes and a definite no, and everything in between. And why might you be a definite yes or no? For all the reasons of diversity, you know, culture, age, background, ethnicity, all those things make up for what might have you in a position on a decision spectrum.
That's what I really love about Australia, is that we are a microcosm of the world, because we do have such diversity here. And I think, being our size, one of our biggest strengths that we don't often utilize is that we're friendly. And if you think about it, we're non-threatening. We're friends with the US, with China, with the UK, and other countries around the world. And we are very highly educated, very smart. And so how do we actually look at the benefits of Australia and using Australia to be able to lead internationally? And so a few things that I love about Australia is, even just on your tax return every year, you get a statement on how your tax dollars were spent. And, you know, you can see all the initiatives that the government are making to then inform and help educate and bring everyone into these decisions, which is really inspiring. So, you know, as we look into the future, and I love that you're working with the government, this is so fantastic. You know, what are some of the new models or decision-making frameworks that are being utilised to current issues that would be great to build this new model and to get everyone involved? And what would that look like?
Right, that's I guess, right, literally one of the reasons that has me in Canberra today is exactly that, where there's a number of different agencies we're working with in bringing, I guess, decision thinking as a new way of thinking about decision making to bear. And I guess what's common across all of those, what we see works for this future of, you know, massive stakeholder participation in decision making, is a set of principles that sit underneath it. And once you start to, I guess, grapple with the principles, you can see, I get a way to shift how decisions are made. And I've kind of alluded to a few of the things, but I think an interesting place to start is this idea of distinguishing a decision process from the decision content. Now, what do I mean by the content? So the content in my example of nuclear waste, the content is, should we store nuclear waste here, or here, or how? That's content, that's the options, that's the problem. Is as soon as you start there, everyone's got an opinion, and you've immediately
pros and cons of whatever happens,
disagreement, and everyone fighting. So a big principle, I guess, under what we're doing with some of the key government departments at the moment is shifting that into, let's just get clear on our decision process. And in fact, you can take a diverse group of people from all ends of the spectrum, and they will agree on a process. So you started with agreement. We've now got our diverse stakeholders, at least from a point of, we're working together, even if no one's yet had to say whether they think it's a good or bad idea to do something, but we've got a process. So let's get a decision process in place, which, like we said at the beginning, if you don't even think of decisions as a thing, then you wouldn't even contemplate the fact there is a process to making decisions. But of course there is. Mostly it's just in our heads, it's undistinguished to us. So if we can start there, at least we've now got a place to work from. And definitely we're seeing that. If I look at, and we work a lot both in New Zealand and here in Australia, which is interesting yourself, because, you know, back to your earlier example, both Australia and New Zealand are quite good microcosms of what's going on out there in the world, and interesting to compare and contrast with each other. So, you know, I've literally worked for the Department of Defence in New Zealand and the Department of Defence in Australia, and you can see the differences, the similarities. You know, the magnitude, of course, is much bigger here in Australia, but a lot of the issues are the same. So starting to see what works here now works here. In fact, we've done quite a bit of, in fact, many people said to me commercially, I was crazy to really bring this thinking to New Zealand ahead of Australia. That's what I did. I moved from the UK to New Zealand many years ago, spent some time there building the business up, and really have now brought that into Australia. And that's great, because so many of the lessons from what works in a smaller economy, but in some respects no less complex than Australia, we can now see starting to play out here. And against a slightly different backdrop. We know the cultural backdrop is different in New Zealand. We know that kind of the First Nations relationships are different and how they've dealt with that's different. So there's a lot of interesting things to learn from that. Yet obviously what we're looking for is what's common and what works well in both environments. And so this idea of decision processes that we can point to in New Zealand and say, well, this worked, let's try it here, and has been, frankly, and you know, I've said this to many of the federal government departments, credit to some of the senior leadership in the federal government to be bold enough to say, well, we can learn some lessons from Australia. It would be tempting to say, you know, what's that small nation got that we want to learn from, right? There's a, you know, sometimes you can hear that in the background, but actually bold moves, many of the, pretty much everything we're doing here today in the federal government, we've done in some shape or form for the New Zealand government. And that's a lot of great learning there. So I think that's, you know, that's one thing. Another thing, I guess, that's working is that much greater propensity for wider stakeholder participation in an active way. And, you know, the government necessarily has the machinery it needs to do what it does. And sometimes it's kind of becomes a bit self-unfulfilling. The nature of different government departments and portfolios and where money is allocated, etc., will drive a necessarily kind of siloed activity, which some people would say is important because the silos allow for differences of opinion, etc., etc. What I'd say is, and what we see is, finding ways to bring the silos together in a constructive way provides for greater diversity, but also a greater overall outcome. And so, for example, what's working is federal government departments starting to bring people from other government departments into their decision processes, even though it's their decision process, no one else really has any rights over it. Yet actually, if I bring you in from, if I'm sitting in, I don't know, Department of Defense, and I bring you in from Department of Finance, or I bring you in from Foreign Affairs and Trade, I now get a different perspective on my decision. Even though it's my decision, I still get to sign off on it. I still take it up to government for authority. I'm now getting a much broader spectrum. And we saw great shifts in government thinking in New Zealand. In fact, my secret, not so secret mission when I arrived in New Zealand was to change the way the New Zealand government made decisions. And, you know, we had a great success at doing that in many of the processes. So, you know, now we're doing that here.
That's very cool. And so I love how it's, you know, agreeing on how to make a decision first. And then I guess it gets into the nitty gritty, and most of the, you know, the community who are watching and part of this conversation with us today have probably done a pros and cons list, and, you know, they've made their own decision in a structured way sometimes. I guess it gets really complex when you're making a decision on behalf of an entire nation. And then, you know, how do you then actually fairly and transparently get everyone involved in it? And I think this is where it brings us into that futuristic view of, let's say, in 10, 20 years' time, what could it look like to have a lot more people involved, or all stakeholders involved in a decision?
Yeah, a great question. And I think if I just draw a line from perhaps some of the pioneering thinking we're doing today to where that could look. And actually, interesting, just as a side comment, when we look at the technology space, some of this change from our perspective is being accelerated by the current environment. Because of, you know, as you will have gathered, my passion for people in decision processes, a lot of the work we've done has been very physical. Let's put people in a room, let's get the right stakeholders together, etc. And that's, you know, been highly successful. But of course, all of a sudden that hasn't been possible while we've been in lockdown and countries' borders closed and so on. And so looking at testing, I guess, for ourselves, some of our own things that we hold true, and saying, well, how far can you push that, let's say, virtual participation in social decision processes? And, you know, we've seen some great results. In fact, we've seen the spectrum. We've seen some things where we've gone a little too far and it's become too disconnected that it is no longer a social process, and you lose the value of a social decision-making process. And then we've seen other areas where actually it's allowed for wider participation. So I can certainly foresee the future where, of course, it won't need 25 million people to come into the same room together. And the level of, I guess, real-timeness as to the interaction with the decision is one of those things we're also exploring. One of the reasons social decision-making works, of course, is because when I put forward my opinions or my views or my perspectives, and there are other people to test and challenge, I learn something else about my own opinions. I might be strong on one side of an equation, you might be strong on another, And through a conversation that you and I have, we both get to learn. Now, I might not move my position, you might not move your position, but I get greater understanding and confidence in my own position. And so how do you replicate that in a way that isn't simply a long offline kind of to and fro? You know, what works well is we can have this conversation right now, and all of a sudden the learning happens in our minds. So there's aspects there of technology, is how are we able to engage people in real time? There's also, I think, the information conversation. One of the things that we also noticed that hasn't worked well in the past and is not surprising, is that when people put things forward to support in a decision process, let's say they're making a case for an investment, historically it's been, here's all the great reasons why you must do this, I fully support this, you'd be crazy if you didn't, you know, please support this business case. That's how things typically have come forward into decision processes. And immediately they switch on things like all these biases that are going on in our brains that are unconscious to us, and either have us go, yes, let's go, or how dare you, I'm not supporting that. And all of a sudden it's a very unconscious decision process. A shift is towards much more fact-based, straightforward information that says, here's what we're dealing with. This investment supports this many people in this way. That's it. Not, and you must support it. Not, it's the best thing since sliced bread. None of that. Let's just have the factual information. And as long as that's presented across maybe all your alternatives that you're considering, such as in a budget, then you've got a much stronger basis for a balanced conversation around why this or this. So that's another piece that we're seeing, is the way you articulate what comes forward, the way it's presented, and people can engage with it, cutting through, you know, especially when you look at 25 million stakeholders, using language that people can engage with, describing things in certain ways, relating it to a much more real world, helps provide that accessibility to the information needed. One of the things that surprises many people is you actually need a lot less information to support decision making than people might think. And of course, you know, it's perhaps not surprising that those people who want to write this 35-page business case to support this thing that's really important to me are going to want to keep writing more and more information just to make it sound more and more important. But actually, if they could boil that down to half a page, that might be more useful to support a decision process. So we often find less is more with things like the supporting information and so on, because us as human beings are very good at grappling with things at a more strategic level and making comparisons when we can see clearly how things sort of line up next to each other. So there's I think that's another thing of the future, will be the way things are even presented to us. You won't read a manifesto of a party that says, here's all the great things we're going to do, and blowing our trumpet and full of information to inflate how good it looks. It'll be much more fact-based and presented in ways that we can access it in our own view, in our own language, in our own way of engaging with it, but cuts through, let's call it the hype. So I think that's another thing that will happen. And then probably the key to the jigsaw puzzle is the distinction between what it is you're deciding. So all the things, let's say the list of things that could go into the federal budget, or the list of investments that you're about to make, or whatever, from the how you choose between them. And this, you know, as many people would know, in any decision process, you tend to call these the criteria. These are the things that we care about. How do these things stack up? Getting really clear on those is a critical part of any good, transparent, structured decision process. And you know, one of the things we've also been seeing is, you know, I'm holding up 5 fingers for a reason. Very typically, very big, complex decision processes, 5 criteria is a meaningful, requisite, sufficient number to help solve the problem. So if you can agree on these, so forget which options, let's just agree as stakeholders that the things that we care about are, I don't know, let's say the safety and well-being of Australia, the international relationships Australia holds, the long-term future. If you can imagine what they might be, we can agree on those, then anything we might think of spending our money on, we can use this lens to look at. And now it gives us a clear basis for saying why this thing may or may not be a better investment than this thing. And there's, again, done some really interesting work in this domain, and I can see how the future of that looks as well.
So I'm not sure if I should ask you this or not. Let's say it was a decision that needed to be made about Victoria being in lockdown or not. how would you engage people to help make that decision, and what sort of education and what sort of information would you get? And then what do you think that the public reaction would be as they were engaged?
Oh, yeah. And of course you could answer that question.
I had to.
Well, it's a great example to use because, of course, it's very current for us. It is one of the things that so I will answer, I'm not avoiding it, but what it does illustrate an interesting phenomenon that I've kind of alluded to, but I want to point to specifically is we all as human beings have these unconscious cognitive biases driving our decision making. It's how our brains wire. There's a lot of whole realm of decision science that looks at cognitive bias. And mostly it's undistinguished. That's why it's unconscious. So we don't know that we have a predisposition to one thing or the other. Sometimes it's obvious when you look at things like, you look at the extremes like racism and sexism, that's clear what bias looks like. But frankly, and most of us, I imagine on this call would consider ourselves not into that extreme. But frankly, we are all biased in many different ways. And so one of the challenges is to cut through that. One of the, I guess, things that's most present to us at the moment, and to use a technical term, is a thing called availability bias. What this tells us is our decisions and our opinions are strongly given by the environment we're in. And as soon as we talk about anything to do with coronavirus, immediately there's this huge availability bias that pops up because of the channels that we follow on social media, because of the news that we read, because of the conversations we have, because of the people we keep as friends. And so as soon as you say, what should Victoria do, or should Victoria be in lockdown or not, what unconscious to us pops up into our heads is all this world of opinion that we've got from social media and all these other dimensions. So it actually is one of the things that's making decision-making harder and harder in modern times in this ever-connected digital age. So just a thing to notice. And so one of the ways I would say, how would you approach that? The first thing is you somehow got to cut through some of that cognitive bias. And one of the ways, so obviously, technology and I'm certainly not going to make any predictions about the future of some of this technology, but technologies that allow us to get really clean on what's the data versus the opinion, so fake news and so on. How do we cut through that so that we know it's real? So that's the first thing. But secondly, it's also to understand the why of the decision. And this, I think, is one of the things that is often missing, because as soon as like I alluded to earlier, as soon as you talk about a COVID decision, such as Victorian lockdown or not, I would say, well, why is it a good or a bad thing that it's in lockdown? And you got to look at all sides of the equation. So you might say it's a good thing because it prevents community transmission. And so why is that a good thing? Because in itself, you might say, so what? Well, that's a good thing because fewer people are sick and die, so there's a health benefit.
People don't want to lose their grandparents. And
yeah, so you can see why it's a good thing to be in lockdown. Okay, well, why is it a bad thing? Well, it's a bad thing because the freedom of the people, the mental health issues that are coming up through isolation. So there's a whole bunch of bad things. Right now, let's look at the other side of the equation. Why would it be a good thing to reduce? So you can start to have a conversation about the why even before you get to the should we do X or Y. So that's one thing I'd be doing, is let's really look at, let's really get explicit about what's going on. And, also cut through some of the hype that some people might say, and I've heard this is not my opinion, but I've heard people saying, oh, it's, electioneering or whatever. It's other factors that you might consider kind of noise in a process. Let's park all those. So, okay, we can see why it's a good or a bad thing. The other thing I'd say, and there's a lot of research on this, is that actually, firstly, reframe the question. Not should Victoria be in lockdown or not, but what are some alternatives? So, it's not simply turn it off, turn it on, is also degrees. And we know New Zealand did this very well in terms of right up front of coronavirus. They said, here's the levels we're going to talk about. And they created a range of options that one could grapple with and say, should it be level 2 or 3? And what does that look like? So have a set of options rather than just simply should Victoria be in lockdown or not. So once you've got some options and you've also got some, what we would call criteria, the why it's a good thing or a bad thing for some of these options, at least now I can construct a conversation that says, if I consider this thing against these, this one sits kind of here compared to this. And you start to go through what a process, of course, that everyone would know is prioritization of your options, stacking them up against each other. And what emerges through that conversation is actually it looks like the best approach is this, trading off, back to that word we used right at the beginning, all of these different things I could get, because I know I'm going to try, some of these things are going to be orthogonal, they're going to be at odds with each other. We know the lack of freedom does not stimulate the economy in the same way, yet the lack of freedom does improve the health system. So I've now got two things that are at odds with each other. What we know is that by the time you consider all those, there is a balance to be struck between the trade-offs. And yes, I'm prepared to have less impact on the economy than I would, for example, the health system. I think the challenge at the moment in people's opinion about it, like I said, there's obviously a lot of misinformation. And I think just the lack of understanding as to what those trade-offs are. One of the things we talk a lot about in kind of the world of decision making is get really clean on your trade-offs. If we do this, that means we don't get that. Okay, you're sure? There is no have your cake and eat it. That is just, we know how the world works. And I think if you hear the rhetoric and people say, because there was a lot of talk about this in New Zealand in the middle of it, or I'd say in Australia about New Zealand, which is, they've just gone for health versus the economy, people versus New Zealand. It's like, it's much more complex than that. And, we know straight away that why might you want to preserve health? Well, obviously lives, but you're actually trying to preserve the healthcare system. You're trying to manage the future risk of system overload. There's a bunch of other things that come from a lockdown that aren't just about stopping so many people get sick. And unfortunately, this is where, lies and statistics, that of course, as soon as people only track new cases per day or number of deaths from coronavirus, those numbers can look, frankly, diminishingly small certainly in the Australia and New Zealand context. You go, it seems like a lot of investment to save one life, right? You can imagine people having that conversation. And then you say, well, no, it's not just to save one life. Here's everything else that comes with that. Here's all the other things that matter. And so that's how I would approach it. I wouldn't begin to kind of guess as to whether people are satisfied or dissatisfied with the current decisions that are being made, but I can certainly see how through that, I guess, greater level of structure and transparency of why and what, once that's clearer, and if people imagine participation in decision making could look like you having a say as to what these why are. I could say, Lisa Andrews, why do you think it's a good idea to close the borders or not close the borders? And what you have to say could feature in this set of criteria. If you knew what you said was represented here and you knew these decisions were made against this, your interest and engagement in that decision would be completely different from probably currently, where you sit back and say, well, someone's made a call and I don't even know why.
And I think that's where the education and information comes in, that is so important. And understand now in our current state with technology, we don't have the ability to really quickly gather a response from everyone. Although I was very impressed on how quickly that they were able to roll out JobKeeper and JobSeeker. And I think this is a sign of the times that the technology is empowering us to be able to act and or decide and act a lot quicker than it was possible in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point there, because if you look at another aspect of that same thing, which is a much less impactful, but just as a resident of New South Wales, what the New South Wales state government have done is introduced a shortcut to the check-in application. When we go to a restaurant, we scan the QR code and it checks us in. Up until relatively recently, these were all third-party apps, and each time you had to put in your new name and so on. Now, these are small, tiny kind of barriers, but they're all barriers, and they're technology barriers where, well, why don't they know who I am? Well, of course, now many places have a New South Wales QR code. I click on that, it opens up my Service New South Wales app, which is, of course, knows who I am through highly, managed data. And from that, they can say, great, we know where you are, you've checked in, it's all done. So as a user experience, it's great. Of course, the trade-off for me is I've got to be prepared to have the Service New South Wales app with my driver's license on my phone, and I've got to have confidence in how they're going to manage my data. So there's a trade-off I made that in a very, very small way makes it easier for me to access eating at a restaurant. But that's a technology piece that we know has suddenly had to come out of nowhere, the idea of checking at a restaurant. When did we ever have to do that? And all of the hoops that had to get put through. And you can see where that could take us, given all the other concerns around privacy and data ownership and how does that look, which is definitely is not my field, I should say.
Yeah, I guess this is the opportunity for us to geek out a little bit about technology, and that's great. QR codes now, like in 10, 20 years time, will we have visual facial recognition? I know I'm wearing an Aura ring. It tells me if my temperature's high. You know, what kind of data is the world going to have, or, you know, our government's going to have to be able to help us make those decisions. I know things like temperature checking. At the moment, there's scanners that can scan a room and know the heartbeat of how fast your heart's beating of all the people in the room, and be able to do a real pulse check on people. What sort of technology like that could be utilized? So rather than checking into restaurants, understand that, tracing, awesome. What if it was a decision on a national park that had to be made, and they were able to tell from facial recognition who had been to the national park, and then include them as stakeholders on does the nuclear waste go near that park, and then the other parks that are potential contenders, or, you know, whatever it may be. What technology do you think would be available in 20 years that will make decision making easier?
I think that's and you know, and I know my own personal opinions about some of these things. And you know, I come from a country where there's no compulsory voting and no compulsory national identity, right? So into a different environment, and I know from my own view that frankly, the world knowing who I am and what I'm doing serves me. So I've got my own trade-offs in my head that said, yes, were it possible to track me through, frankly, we do it with our cats and dogs, you know, pretty much, you know, anyone who gets their cat and dog, in fact, if you get them from a rescue shelter, they're probably already chipped, which means if that cat or dog is found anywhere, quick scan, we know exactly who it is. So why not human beings? Well, we know why people might think it's a bad idea for all those trade-offs that they may or may not be prepared to make. But I suspect that's where we're going to head. And the opportunity, of course, is us to have agency over that, rather than it just be something that looks like it's passive, like, well, we saw your face, so we worked it out, versus me saying, I'm here, you know, here, I've got whatever it is that means there's no, the actual access to who I am, where I am is immediate and instantaneous and requires no input from me other than my permission. Given my permission, it's all managed. I suspect that's where it's going to end up. And if you think about the 25 million stakeholder decision, you know, we need to know you are a stakeholder. Like you said, am I actually a stakeholder of that park? That park might it be in, I don't know, rural New South Wales, and I might live in WA. What really does that, am I impacted by that park? Probably not. So how would I manage my involvement in the decision about that park? As you say, well, we know you use it, we know you're nearby, whatever it might be. I also think so yeah, I think there's a lot of technology there. I think the other thing that's coming, and again, this isn't my field, so I don't want to get too far off piece, but so what we say in decision making is what you need is requisite data to support the decision. So sufficient. We know the temptation with the world of big data is, well, we've got data about everything, so just more data is always better, isn't it? And often my argument would be, through a decision-making lens, not necessarily, because more data can hide what you're trying to see, or you can get overwhelmed by the data. So I would always ask the question about data from what's the decision you're trying to make, and therefore what's the data that's useful, rather than given this data, what decisions can we make? Now, I know also there's a whole nother world that looks in the realm of, data, and I know someone who's on this call will be smiling as I say this, and looks from that perspective, given what we do know or can find out, what does that tell us? What insights does that give us? And so I think there's, you know, both sides of the spectrum are equally valid. I tend to look from this end, which is given what decisions we're trying to make, what can support that, so that I only have that and not everything else. And that's, I think, is going to be the interesting piece. I might need to be recognized as a stakeholder of that park to make decisions in it. So all you need to know is I use the park. You don't need to know I've used it 5 times a day and I came here yesterday evening to walk my dog and tomorrow morning I'm coming to do my exercise. That makes no impact on my participation in the decision process. So you only need that piece of data about me. Now, someone else might want some other, and I think that's where that sort of very clear distinction of the uses for the data, what it's supporting and for what purposes, and the agency we have over that, I think is, you know, I would say is where it's going. But again, I'm definitely not a data scientist.
I love the idea in the future, and you talk about involving people in the process, is that you could actually say, these are the issues that are important to me, and these are the things that I'd like to be included in the decision-making process. So you're actually putting it out there that actually, if there is something that's going to be decided around an investment in New South Wales, then that's something that I'm interested in learning about and knowing if I can contribute or not to that decision. I think
Yeah,
that's one thing, and that's on policy, and that's on a more of a micro level. But then on a macro level, then what do we do from a point of view where we have mandatory voting? What does the future of voting, and what could that look like where we all have a say in policy rather than party?
Yeah, and that's again, like always, the devil's in the detail. And from what I know and how I see the world of decision making evolving, and just even this decision consciousness, I guess, this idea of decisions by design, by versus chance, I think is it changes even what some of the mechanics. When you think about things like policies and so on, and as you say, the electoral system. It's like, well, if I actually get to participate in a specific decision, whatever it might be, about building that new park or building that new hospital or whatever, then how I relate to that decision is different from how I might relate to a different decision because of the context and who I am and my opinion. I think one of the interesting things is, and what occurred to me as you were speaking, is the part of the challenge is even knowing what issues you are interested in. Now, we can sit and have a conversation. You can tell me the issues you're interested in. Yet I suspect sometimes issues appear, you might not even realize you were interested. Frankly, a high level of unconsciousness to us in the world, not in a bad way, but just frankly, if we walk through the world with everything we cared about in front of us, we'd never get anywhere. But there's an unconsciousness. So, and this is a great place, I think, where data and some of the techniques in things like AI are really going to help us, because they can help us see what we don't even know matters to us. So instead of, really the future isn't so much tick the boxes against the things you care about. It's more from your data, we think you're going to be interested in this stuff. Does that make sense? Oh, actually, yeah, those are. Oh, I never thought I'd have an opinion about a new park. And in fact, probably when I ticked the box, I didn't have any children, so I wouldn't. But now I care deeply about whether they've got swings and a slide and so on. And so who I am and my behavior is now starting to indicate what matters to me. And I think one of the not that far away futures is really getting clear on when I talk about things like criteria and what you care about, it's right, it's not so much a question, it's more about working out from your behaviors, from how you operate. Now we know let's call it the dark side of that, which, and those of us who watched Social Dilemma on Netflix will know, the dark side is you care about what I tell you to care about, and if I tell you it in the right way, and I'm being oversimplifying, but if I tell you it in the right way, you will start to care about the things I should tell you should be caring about, and in which case, where are we in that piece? We're lost completely. But
yeah,
putting that on
the fake news story and the virality of it can be really dangerous.
Oh,
and I think
exactly,
that's a huge opportunity for us with the government decisions, and whether it be voting on the federal election each year. We know that it's coming from a trusted source, and I think this is a really great opportunity to be able to help educate and inform people on the decisions that are being made and the policy, so that maybe in 20 years time we do have the technology that will be home voting, but we'll also be going through and saying a survey of, I care about this, or would you like this to happen or that to happen? And you can go through and then policy by policy understand what decisions you would make to then submit that, which you'd mentioned in our previous conversation, that then even if your decision wasn't chosen, that it's been fair and it's been transparent, and that the majority of people have voted the other way, and so you're more willing to accept that.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. If we think about, it's one thing actually, and every time I say this, I'm transforming the way the world makes decisions that matter. Transforming doesn't just look like making the decision. It looks like having the decision stick and live in the world. And like I said, as we know from many examples, you can make the decision on the flip of a coin, but do you support it? Probably not. Whereas exactly as you say, we know, And all the evidence suggests that what has people support a decision. So it's one thing to say it was my choice to, lock down Victoria or not. It's a different thing to say I think they shouldn't lock it down, but I can support the decision to lock it down. And that's where you want to get to, because that's the world with people empowered in their decision making and can sit back and go, I can see how they reached that. Yeah, fair call. And it's, I personally have facilitated many very tough, very senior decisions past the points where people would have started from, I'm never going to agree with that person, whatever you do, don't put me in a room with them. And at the end of them, through a good process, have stepped back and gone, oh, I didn't expect that. We reached that decision. And because it was transparent, I participated in the way I chose to participate, I now have ownership in that decision. Even if, and I can still sit back and say, don't like the decision, but I support it. And that's the biggest difference, because then that provides for, takes away so much of the upset and so much of the energy actually that's wasted after the decision. Of course, people don't like the trade-off called a bit more energy put into making the decision, saves you that down track. But that's another issue with us as human beings. We want everything now, and the long term can go hang.
Yeah, definitely. So I know we're getting close to time here, and I think a lot of us are all seeing the value that the government provides to Australia. For me in particular, I loved our no one left behind approach with JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and a lot of the different initiatives and stimulus that they've already put out. You're in Canberra right now, the budget's almost coming out. Do you have any last thoughts to share with us?
I guess actually what I would say is, and I'm with you, I would say for all of us, just knowing that there's a lot of, that decision making is complex, there are better ways of making decisions. And at the moment, a lot of decisions are made with a bunch of unconsciousness driving it, that, there's a little bit of a sympathy we can have for the government. When the Treasurer stands up at 7:30 and hands down the budget, we know there's going to be winners and losers. There's trade-offs that have been made. Some people are going to throw stones, some people are going to be upset, some people are going to be happy. It's kind of a nature of how it's going to go. So if nothing else, we can at least sit back and go, this is tough. So it's not just, well, if I was the boss, then I know exactly what I do. It isn't that. It doesn't go that way. So I guess enough of a recognition on how, it would be enough of a recognition of how hard it actually is to at least give a bit of freedom and a bit of air to what needs to be done, the hard decisions to be made. Now, for me, if we can have a budget that actually was brought together by the government rather than here's my party's view and that's what it is and everyone else has to fight about it, well, that would be a great step forward, I think.
Beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much. I am going to wind us up there. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us. Thank you for your comments in the chat and for your engagement in the online learning community. And we also have Technologies of the Future webinar on Friday morning. Please join us for that. Check out our website, singularityaustralia.com, for our upcoming programs. And once again, thank you for joining us. Let's design the world we want to live in the next 20 years and beyond.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Good night.